Picture this. You are standing in the shadow of massive stone columns. Their surfaces scarred by desperate chisel marks. The air burns with desert heat, thick with dust that tastes of crushed limestone and forgotten prayers. All around you, workers swing hammers against ancient walls, obliterating names, faces, entire histories carved in stone. The sound echoes like thunder through the empty halls of Karnak, each blow erasing another piece of revolution that once promised to reshape the world. The year is 1334 BC. The pharaoh who dared to challenge 3,000 years of tradition is dead. His city lies abandoned. His god has been forgotten. And his name Akhenaten, the one who was pleasing to the Aten, is being systematically carved from every surface in Egypt as if he never existed at all. But 18 years earlier, this same man stood as the most powerful ruler on earth, commanding armies that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates. He gazed upon the Sun Disk and declared that everything his ancestors believed was a lie, before diving into this forgotten story of divine revolution and familial bonds that shocked even ancient Egypt. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The transformation began quietly. In 1353 BC, a teenage prince named Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne of Egypt. His father, Amenhotep III, had ruled for 38 years of unprecedented prosperity, leaving behind temples that glittered with gold and a kingdom that stretched across the known world. The young pharaoh should have been content to follow the path his ancestors had walked for millennia, honoring Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, and maintaining the cosmic order that had blessed Egypt for centuries. But something burned within this young king. Perhaps it was the intensity with which he gazed upon the morning sun as it rose over the Nile. Perhaps it was the whispers of priests who spoke of Aten, the Sun Disk, as more than just another face of Ra. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a vision that came to him in dreams, a voice that spoke from the very heart of the sun itself. Historical records suggest Akhenaten was born around 1380 BC, the son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, growing up in the opulent palace complex at Malkata, where his father's reign epitomized the zenith of the 18th dynasty's power. As a prince, he may have been exposed to evolving solar theology at Heliopolis, the center of sun worship, planting seeds for his later reforms amid a court buzzing with foreign envoys and intellectual exchanges. The court at Thebes in those early years of the 1350s BC was a glittering spectacle of power and ancient tradition. Vast temple complexes dominated the city, their pylons rising like artificial mountains against the desert sky. The Temple of Karnak alone employed thousands of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and servants. Its treasury overflowed with tribute from conquered lands, gold from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from the heart of Africa. The high priest of Ammonius wielded influence that rivaled the pharaoh himself, controlling not just religious life, but vast estates that produced much of Egypt's wealth. Into this ancient world stepped a young man who would challenge everything. Contemporary records describe Amenhotep IV as physically distinctive, tall and lanky with an elongated skull, narrow shoulders, and wide hips that gave him an androgynous appearance. Later artists would exaggerate these features to almost grotesque proportions. But even in his youth, the prince stood apart from the traditional ideal of Egyptian kingship. His education would follow the patterns established for royal children over many centuries. He learned to read and write hieroglyphs, study mathematics and astronomy, receive instruction in military tactics and statecraft. But somewhere in this conventional curriculum, seeds of revolution were planted. Perhaps it was in the temple schools where he first encountered the hymns to Aten that would later inspire his transformation. Perhaps it was in conversations with foreign diplomats who brought news of monotheistic stirrings in distant lands. Scholars debate whether Akhenaten's unique physical depictions in art reflect actual conditions like Marfan syndrome or were symbolic, representing fertility and divine androgyny, blending male and female principles to mirror the Aten's creative essence. By his fourth year as pharaoh, Amenhotep IV had begun construction of temples dedicated to the Aten at Karnak itself. In the very shadow of Ammonia's greatest sanctuary, the priests watched with growing alarm as the young king elevated this minor solar deity above their ancient god. The first signs of revolution appeared not in proclamations, but in art. The rigid eternal poses of Egyptian sculpture gave way to something startling in its intimacy. Relief carvings showed the royal family beneath the outstretched rays of the Aten, each ray ending in a tiny hand offering the ankh of life. These early artistic innovations were revolutionary in ways that are difficult to appreciate today. For 3,000 years, Egyptian art had followed strict conventions designed to capture eternal, timeless truth rather than temporary appearances. Pharaohs were always shown in idealized form, young, physically perfect, posed in positions that emphasize their divine nature. The sudden appearance of art that showed genuine human emotion that captured specific moments in time rather than eternal principles must have shocked contemporary viewers. The Amarna style, as it's known, emphasized naturalism and intimacy, with scenes of the royal family in relaxed poses, Akhenaten kissing his daughters on Nefertiti, cradling children, breaking from the formal, hierarchical depictions of earlier dynasties, possibly reflecting a cultural shift toward personal piety and family-centric values amid the religious upheaval. His queen Nefertiti stood beside him in these images, not as a distant figure of majesty, but as a living, breathing woman. Marriage alliances in the Egyptian royal house were typically arranged for political reasons, but contemporary sources suggest that Akhenaten and Nefertiti shared a genuine romantic bond that was unprecedented in royal relationships. Their daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, and Khesempeten, and the others who would follow are depicted as real children reaching toward their parents, playing beneath the benevolent gaze of their new god. The name Meritaten means beloved of the Aten, while Khesempeten translates to she lives for the Aten. Even in choosing names for his daughters, Akhenaten was making theological statements, declaring that his children existed not merely as members of the royal family, but as living embodiment of divine favor. These names would prove prophetic in ways that the young king could not have imagined when his first daughter was born around 1350 BC. The priests of Ammonius grew restless. For 3,000 years, they had controlled the spiritual life of Egypt. Their god commanded the largest temples, controlled vast estates, and received the lion's share of Egypt's tribute. The mythology surrounding Ammonius was impossibly complex, involving hundreds of deities, elaborate creation stories, and intricate funerary practices that promised eternal life to those who could afford proper mummification and burial. Now, a young pharaoh was suggesting that their elaborate system, the foundation of Egyptian civilization, was nothing but superstition. Akhenaten's elevation of the Aten is seen by some Egyptologists as henotheism rather than strict monotheism, where the Aten was supreme but other gods weren't entirely denied initially, though by year 9, he ordered the defacement of Ammonius name-across temples, signaling a radical break. The economic implications of Akhenaten's religious reforms were staggering. The temple of Ammonius at Karnak alone owned more than 80,000 slaves for 120,000 head of cattle and 900 square miles of agricultural land. The priesthood controlled roughly one-third of all cultivatable land in Egypt, making them not just religious leaders, but economic powerhouses. By elevating the Aten above Ammonius, Akhenaten was threatening to disrupt an economic system that had functioned successfully for millennia. In his 5th year of rule, Amenhotep IV made a declaration that would echo through history. He would no longer be known by the name that honored Ammonius. From now on, he would be called Akhenaten, effective for the Aten or devoted to the Aten. His queen Nefertiti became Nefertiti. Beautiful is the beauty of the Aten. Their daughters received new names that praise their god. Even their city would be transformed. But transformation was not enough. By his 6th year as pharaoh, Akhenaten had made a decision that shocked his court and terrified his people. He would abandon Thebes entirely. Somewhere between Memphis in the north and Thebes in the south, he would build a completely new city dedicated solely to the Aten. He called this place Akedaton, Horizon of the Aten. The decision to abandon Thebes was not made lightly. The city had been the religious and political center of Egypt for over 500 years. Its temples contained the tombs of Akhenaten's ancestors. Its palaces housed the administrative machinery that governed an empire. and its population included the most skilled craftsmen and learned scribes in the ancient world. To leave all this behind in favor of an empty stretch of desert demonstrated either supreme confidence or dangerous megalomania. The move to Akhenaten, founded around 1346 BCE, was marked by boundaries steelly declaring the site chosen by the Aten itself, free from prior religious associations, allowing a pure canvas for Atenism, though it strained resources and alienated traditional power centers. The site he chose lay on the east bank of the Nile, about 200 miles north of Thebes, in a region that had no significant previous occupation. The location was backed by limestone cliffs that formed a natural amphitheater, and as the sun rose each morning, it seemed to emerge directly from these cliffs, creating a daily miracle that reinforces theology. The virgin territory also meant that the new city would be free from associations with the old gods, a clean slate upon which to inscribe his revolutionary vision. Construction began immediately, employing a workforce that may have numbered in the tens of thousands. Quarries were opened in the surrounding cliffs, providing limestone for the city's foundations. More exotic materials were imported from across the empire: granite from Aswan, sandstone from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon. The Nile provided transportation for the massive quantities of stone and timber required for the project. Akhenaten was built with remarkable speed using a revolutionary construction technique. The architects employed standardized stone blocks called talatat, each measuring roughly 20 by 10 by 15 inches, that could be quarried, transported, and assembled much faster than the massive stones of traditional Egyptian construction. These blocks were small enough for a single man to carry, allowing for rapid construction while maintaining the monumental scale expected of royal architecture. Archaeological excavations at Amarna reveal a city planned with precision, including worker villages like the Eastern Village, where artisans lived in modest homes, highlighting social stratification even in this utopian capital, with evidence of malnutrition and hard labor among the lower classes. Within 2 years, the basic infrastructure was complete: palaces, temples, administrative buildings, and residential quarters for the court officials who had followed their pharaoh into the desert. The city stretched for over 5 miles along the Nile, with the royal precincts occupying the central area and residential districts extending both north and south. A royal road connected the various palace complexes, allowing the king to travel from his official residence to his private apartments without leaving the royal precinct. The great temple of the Aten dominated the city's heart, covering an area of roughly 800 by 300 meters. Unlike traditional Egyptian temples, which were dark, mysterious places where only priests could enter the inner sanctuary, this temple was entirely open to the sky. The structure consisted of a series of courtyards connected by columned halls with hundreds of offering tables arranged in neat rows throughout the complex. No walls blocked the sun's rays from touching every corner of the sacred space. There were no hidden chambers, no secret rituals, no elaborate mythology to interpret. The god was the sun itself, visible to all, requiring no intermediaries. The theology of Atenism, as it developed in Akhenaten, was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Unlike the traditional Egyptian pantheon, which included hundreds of deities with complex interrelationships and competing mythologies, Atenism posited a single universal creator god whose power was manifested through the visible sun disk. The Aten was described as the source of all life, the creator of all nations and peoples, and the sustainer of the natural world. The great hymn to the Aten, inscribed in the tomb of the courtier Ai, and possibly composed by Akhenaten himself, provides insight into theological sophistication of the new religion. How manifold are your works! They are hidden from the face of man. O sole God, like whom there is no other, you did create the world according to your desire, whilst you were alone. All men, cattle, and wild beasts, whatever is on earth, going upon its feet, and whatever is on high, fly with its wings. This hymn, echoing themes of creation and universal benevolence, bears striking similarities to Psalm 104, sparking debates on cultural exchanges between Egypt and the Levant, though direct influence remains unproven. This hymn demonstrates remarkable parallels to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible, leading some scholars to speculate about possible connections between Atenism and early monotheistic traditions in the ancient Near East. The emphasis on a single universal creator god who maintains a natural world through direct action was revolutionary in the polytheistic environment of the ancient world. In his 9th year as pharaoh, Akhenaten moved his entire court to this new capital. The royal family took up residence in a vast palace complex that stretched for over a mile along the river. Gardens bloomed with flowers and trees imported from across the empire, fed by channels that brought Nile water throughout the city. Aviaries housed exotic birds from Nubia and Syria, while pools reflected the sky above, creating the illusion that the Aten's light penetrated even underground chambers. The architecture of the royal palace was as revolutionary as the city's theology. Traditional Egyptian palaces were fortress-like structures designed to emphasize the pharaoh's separation from ordinary humanity. The palace at Akenaten, by contrast, featured large windows, open courtyards, and gardens that brought nature into the heart of the royal residence. The rooms were decorated with painted reliefs showing plants and animals in naturalistic detail, creating an environment that celebrated the natural world rather than human power. For the courtiers who had followed their king to this desert capital, life at Akenaten must have been both exhilarating and unsettling. They were participating in an experiment that had no precedent in human history, the attempt to completely reorganize a civilization around a new religious vision. The daily rhythm of court life revolved around the worship of the Aten, with elaborate ceremonies timed to coincide with the sun's movement across the sky. Morning worship began before dawn as the royal family and court assembled in the great temple to greet the rising sun. As the first rays of light struck the offering tables, priests chanted hymns praising the Aten's daily resurrection. The king and queen, standing beneath the open sky, offered bread, beer, meat, and flowers to their god, while courtiers arranged in strict hierarchical order participated in collective celebration. The afternoon ceremony was equally elaborate, timed to coincide with the sun's zenith when the Aten's power was at its peak. Evening worship, as the sun set behind the western cliffs, took on a more somber tone, acknowledging the temporary triumph of darkness while expressing confidence in the light's eventual return. These daily ceremonies provided structure to court life while constantly reinforcing the central message of Atenism that the visible sun was the source of all life and power. Daily life in Amarna blended innovation with tradition. While elites enjoyed imported luxuries and new artistic freedoms, commoners in worker villages faced grueling labor, as evidenced by skeletal remains showing high rate of injury and disease, underscoring the social costs of rapid urbanization. But even in paradise, the complexities of royal succession demanded attention. Nefertiti had given Akhenaten 6 daughters, but no son to inherit the throne. In the rigid world of pharaonic Egypt, this presented a crisis that required unprecedented solutions. The succession laws of the new kingdom were complex, involving not just blood relationships, but also religious qualifications and political considerations. A pharaoh needed to be recognized by the priesthood, accepted by the military, and capable of maintaining Egypt's international prestige. The problem was made more acute by Akhenaten's religious revolution. Any heir would need to be thoroughly committed to Atenism in order to prevent a restoration of the old religion after his death. This eliminated many potential successors from cadet branches of the royal family who might have been acceptable under normal circumstances, but whose theological commitments were questionable. The answer came in the form of arrangements that would have seemed shocking even by ancient Egyptian standards, though they followed patterns established by Akhenaten's own father and other New Kingdom pharaohs. Royal incest was not unknown in ancient Egypt. Sibling marriages occurred regularly among pharaohs, and there were precedents for father-daughter marriages in extreme circumstances. But the systematic nature of Akhenaten's family arrangements went beyond anything previously documented. While sibling marriages were common to preserve divine bloodlines, evidence for father-daughter unions is debated. Akhenaten's father may have married his daughter Cinnamon, but direct proof for Akhenaten marrying his daughters like Meritaten or Enkhesepitan remains circumstantial, based on titles and reliefs, with scholars divided on whether these indicate actual marriage or ceremonial roles. After Nefertiti's mysterious disappearance from the historical record around the pharaoh's 12th year, whether through death, disgrace, or transformation into a co-ruler under a different name, remains one of Egyptology's great mysteries. Akhenaten turned his daughters to secure his dynasty and maintain his theological revolution. The process began subtly. In reliefs from Akhenaten's later years, his eldest daughter, Meritaten, begins to appear in positions traditionally reserved for the queen. She stands beside her father during religious ceremonies, receives the life-giving rays of the Aten, and is shown wearing regalia associated with queenship. By the 13th year of Akhenaten's reign, she had officially become his chief queen, a role that involved both ceremonial duties and the expectation of producing royal heirs. Aten was probably about 16 years old when she became her father's queen. Contemporary records provide no insight into her feelings about this arrangement, but the psychological complexity of her situation is difficult to imagine. She had grown up in the revolutionary environment of Akhenaten, surrounded by art and literature that celebrated the intimate bonds of family life. The tender domestic scenes that decorated the palace walls showed her as a beloved daughter playing with her sisters beneath the benevolent rays of the Aten. Now she was expected to transform her filial love into conjugal devotion to become both daughter and wife to the same man. The theological justification for this arrangement was complex but internally consistent within Akhenaten's religious system. The Aten was described in royal hymns as both father and mother of all creation, containing within itself both male and female principles. The royal family, as the earthly representatives of divine power, were expected to mirror this cosmic unity. By marrying his daughter, Akhenaten was creating an earthly reflection of divine self-generation, demonstrating that the royal house contained within itself all the creative forces necessary for continued rule. The practical implications were equally important. Each daughter who became queen could potentially produce the male heir that Akhenaten desperately needed to continue his religious revolution. Moreover, by keeping succession within his immediate family, he prevented rival branches of the royal house from challenging his theological innovations. Any child born to these unions would be doubly royal, carrying the bloodline of both pharaoh and queen in a concentration of divine power unprecedented in Egyptian history. Aten's tenure as chief queen lasted approximately 3 years. During this period, she appears regularly in temple reliefs and diplomatic correspondence, suggesting that her role was more than merely ceremonial. The Amarna letters include references to the king's daughter, the queen, indicating that foreign diplomats recognized her elevated status. She may have borne children during this period, though the evidence is ambiguous and the fate of any offspring uncertain. Around the 15th year of Akhenaten's reign, the situation became even more complex. Aten married Smenkhare, a mysterious figure who may have been Akhenaten's brother, son, or adopted heir. This marriage created an unprecedented situation where the daughter queen became simultaneously the wife of 2 pharaohs, her father Akhenaten and his co-regent Smenkhare. The political logic behind this arrangement becomes clearer when viewed in the context of Akhenaten's diplomatic problems. The Amarna letters reveal a kingdom under increasing pressure from external enemies and internal dissent. By the middle of his reign, several Egyptian vassal cities in Syria and Palestine had fallen to invading forces, and there were reports of rebellion in Nubia. The pharaoh needed a co-regent who could handle military affairs while he focused on religious matters. Smenkhare, whose name means vigorous as the soul of Ra, appears to have been chosen specifically to provide this military leadership. His marriage to Aten legitimized his position within the royal family, while creating a potential line of succession that would preserve Akhenaten's religious innovations. The arrangement also freed Akhenaten to pursue a new marriage that would further concentrate divine power within his bloodline. When Aten married Smenkhare, Akhenaten elevated his next eldest daughter, Ankhesepitan, to the position of chief queen. This young woman, who could not have been more than 13 or 14 years old, found herself at the center of a desperate attempt to preserve her father's revolution through bloodline. Her name, meaning she lives to the Aten, proved prophetic in ways that reflected both the hopes and tragedies of the Amarna period. Ankhesepitan's elevation to queenship marked the most extreme phase of Akhenaten's family arrangements. Unlike Aten, who had at least reached physical maturity before becoming queen, Ankhesepitan was still a child when she assumed the burdens of royal marriage. The reliefs showing her beside her father-husband are among the most unsettling artifacts from the Amarna period, depicting a prepubescent girl in the regalia of queenship standing beneath the rays of the Aten in a pose that mimics the earlier images of Nefertiti. The psychological trauma of this arrangement can only be imagined, Ankhesenaten had spent her childhood watching her elder sister transform from sibling to stepmother, observing the complex dynamics of a court where family relationships shifted according to political necessity. Now she faced the same transformation herself, expected to abandon her identity as daughter in favor of the more complex role of daughter, wife, queen. The human cost of these arrangements extended beyond the immediate participants. Akhenaten's other daughters, Nefertiti and Tashret, Neferneferu and Setepenra, lived in a palace where their sisters had become their stepmothers, where the traditional boundaries of family life had been dissolved in service to theological abstraction. The youngest daughters may have been too young to fully understand the implications of what was happening around them, but the older ones must have grasped that their own futures might follow similar patterns. These unions were not merely ceremonial. In the tomb of Akhenaten at Amarna, reliefs show what appears to be Akhenaten in intimate family scenes with his daughter wives, scenes that echo the domestic tranquility depicted in earlier images of his marriage to Nefertiti. The iconography suggests genuine marital relationships rather than purely political arrangements. The king is shown embracing his daughter queens, sharing meals with them, and participating in the private rituals of family life. The death of Akhenaten, another daughter during this period, provides tragic evidence of the physical reality of these relationships. The scenes in a royal tomb showing the death of this young princess are among the most emotionally powerful images in Egyptian art. The royal family is depicted mourning over a woman lying on a birthing bed with midwives and attendants surrounding the deathbed scene. The presence of a wet nurse holding a newborn infant suggests that Akhenaten died in childbirth, possibly after giving birth to her father's child. The identity of Akhenaten's partner remains unclear from the available evidence, but her death during the period when father-daughter marriages were being contracted within the royal family raises disturbing questions about the fate of other daughters who may have been involved in similar relationships. The high rate of infant and maternal mortality in the ancient world made childbirth dangerous under the best circumstances, but pregnancy at a very young age would have increased these risks substantially. DNA analysis of Amarna mummies, including Tutankhamun, reveals inbreeding, with his parents likely siblings, contributing to genetic defects like scoliosis and clubfoot, illustrating the biological toll of royal consanguinity. Meanwhile, the world beyond Akhenaten was growing increasingly unstable. The Amarna letters' diplomatic correspondence found in the ruins of Akhenaten's foreign office reveal a pattern of neglect and confusion in Egypt's international relations. Vassal kings in Syria and Palestine wrote desperate letters begging for military support against invading forces, only to receive no response from a pharaoh who was consumed with his religious experiments and family arrangements. To the king, my lord, my God, my son, message of Rib-Hadda, your servant. The dirt at your feet, wrote the ruler of Byblos in one of many increasingly frantic dispatches. I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times. May the king give thought to his city, and may the king send archers. If this year there are no archers, then all the lands of the king, my lord, will perish. Similar pleas came from rulers throughout the Levant. Abdihiba of Jerusalem wrote multiple letters describing attacks on his territory and begging for immediate military assistance. The king of Mitanni, traditionally Egypt's most important ally in the region, sent increasingly desperate messages as his kingdom came under attack from Hittite forces. But Akhenaten's responses, when they came at all, were vague promises of future support that never materialized. The 382 Amarna letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform, depict a crumbling empire. Vassals like Rib-Hadda of Byblos lamented Egyptian inaction against Hittite advances, leading to losses in Amurru and signaling a shift in Near Eastern power dynamics. The diplomatic correspondence reveals a pharaoh increasingly disconnected from practical realities of governing an empire. His attention was focused inward on perfecting his earthly paradise and securing his dynasty through increasingly complex family arrangements. The great military machine that his father, Amenhotep III, had built began to rust from disuse. Egypt's enemies noted this weakness and began to probe the frontiers with increasing boldness. The internal situation was equally troubling. The displaced priests of Monius may have gone underground, but they had not disappeared. In the provincial temples scattered throughout the Nile Valley, local priests continued to serve the old gods in secret. waiting for the day when traditional order would be restored. Archaeological evidence suggests that Atenism never penetrated deeply into Egyptian society outside the royal court. The common people denied access to their familiar deities may have maintained traditional religious practices in private, while paying lip service to the Aten Revolution. The economic disruption caused by the religious revolution was also becoming apparent. The vast temple estates that had been transferred from Ammonius to the Aten required new administrative structures and personnel loyal to the new regime. Traditional trade relationships, many of which had religious components, were disrupted when trading partners refused to recognize the legitimacy of Atenist priests. The concentration of resources on building and maintaining Akhenaten came at the expense of other infrastructure projects throughout the kingdom. The redirection of temple revenues likely caused economic strain, with Atenism's focus on royal monopoly over worship reducing the priesthood's influence and potentially leading to widespread discontent among elites and commoners alike. The common people found little to love in Akhenaten's revolution. The Aten was a distant intellectual deity who offered none of the personal comfort provided by gods like Isis or Osiris. The elaborate festivals and religious celebrations that had marked the rhythm of Egyptian life for centuries were replaced by sterile ceremonies focused entirely on the royal family's relationship with their solar god. Where traditional religion had offered hope for ordinary people, the promise of eternal life for those who lived according to Ma'at, divine order, the comfort protective deities who could be appealed to in times of trouble, Atenism provided only the remote beneficence of a sun disk. The artistic revolution that had seemed so liberating in the early years of the reign began to take on disturbing characteristics as well. The exaggerated physical features of the royal family, initially interpreted as a move toward realistic portraiture, became increasingly grotesque. Statues of Akhenaten from his later years show him with an impossibly elongated skull, pendulous breasts, and wide hips that obliterate any trace of masculine authority. Whether these represent actual physical characteristics or symbolic representations of his androgynous theology, they created an image of kingship that was deeply unsettling to contemporary viewers. The art depicting the royal family's domestic life, once charming in its intimacy, also became more complex as the family relationships grew more tangled. Reliefs showing Akhenaten with multiple wives and daughters, some of whom were simultaneously his children and his queens, created visual puzzles that viewers struggled to decode. The traditional iconography of Egyptian royal art had no symbols for depicting father-daughter marriages, forcing artists to improvise visual languages that often resulted in images that were both aesthetically beautiful and emotionally disturbing. As Akhenaten entered the final years of his reign, cracks began to appear in his earthly paradise. The diplomatic situation continued to deteriorate, with Egypt losing control over much of its Asiatic empire. Several of his daughters had died, possibly in childbirth, leaving him with fewer potential heirs and creating gaps in his succession planning. The co-regency with Smenkhare, which may have been arranged to provide continuity in military leadership, lasted only a few years before that Pharaoh too disappeared from the records under mysterious circumstances. The king, who had once proclaimed himself the sole intermediary between heaven and earth, found himself increasingly isolated. The great courtiers who had followed him to Akhenaten began to have second thoughts about their commitment to the revolution. Some may have quietly begun making overtures to the traditional priesthood, preparing for the day when the old order would be restored. The luxury and sophistication of life in the new capital could not mask the growing sense that the experiment was failing. Archaeological evidence from Akhenaten's later levels suggests increasing poverty and social disorder within the city itself. The grand palaces and temples were maintained, but the residential districts show signs of abandonment and decay. Craftsmen's workshops that had once produced exquisite art and furniture for the royal court were shuttered. The population, which may have peaked at around 50,000 during the city's heyday, began to drift away as opportunities for advancement diminished, and the political situation became more uncertain. The religious innovations that had once seemed revolutionary began to calcify into rigid orthodoxy. The spontaneous artistic creativity of the early Amarna period gave way to increasingly repetitive imagery focused on the same themes. The royal family worshipping beneath the Aten's rays, the sun disk bestowing life on the earth, the king and his daughter queens participating in religious ceremonies. The theology that had initially offered a more personal and direct relationship with divinity became as formal and hierarchical as the traditional Egyptian religion had replaced. International observers were taking note of Egypt's decline. Hittite records from this period describe Egyptian weakness in increasingly contemptuous terms. Traditional allies began to question their relationships with Pharaoh, who seemed incapable of defending his own territories, much less providing military support to his vassals. The elaborate diplomatic marriages and gift exchanges that had characterized Egyptian foreign policy under Amenhotep III virtually ceased under his son as Akhenaten became increasingly focused on internal affairs. Hittite king Suppiluliuma I exploited Egypt's inaction, conquering Mitanni and vassals like Amurru, as detailed in the Amarna letters, marking a pivotal decline in Egyptian influence in the Levant. In his 17th year as pharaoh around 1336 BC, Akhenaten died. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious. There is no evidence of violence, no indication of plague or obvious illness, no dramatic deathbed scene recorded by court historians. He may have simply worn himself out in his relentless pursuit of religious perfection, or perhaps the psychological strain of his complex family arrangements and the growing pressures of rulership finally took their toll. Some evidence suggests that he may have suffered from a genetic disorder, possibly Marfan syndrome, or another condition that could account for his unusual physical appearance and potentially shortened lifespan. The extreme inbreeding within the royal family during this period would have increased the likelihood of genetic problems, creating a vicious cycle where the very arrangements designed to preserve divine blood purity may have contributed to the dynasty's biological decline. His immediate successor was probably Nefertiti, a mysterious figure who may have been Nefertiti, ruling under a new name, or possibly one of his daughter queens assuming power in her own right. This shadowy pharaoh ruled for perhaps 2 years, attempting to maintain the Atenist Revolution while dealing with the practical problems that Akhenaten had left unresolved. The brief reign of Nefertiti represents a fascinating might have been in Egyptian history. The possibility that a woman might have successfully preserved and modified Akhenaten's innovations while addressing the political and military crises that threatened the kingdom. But the forces of restoration were already in motion. The traditional priesthood, the military establishment, and the administrative bureaucracy had all been marginalized during the Amarna period, but they had not been destroyed. These powerful interests saw in Akhenaten's death an opportunity to reverse the religious revolution and restore the old order that had served their interests for centuries. The child who would become the most famous pharaoh in history emerged from this complex web of family relationships and political intrigue. Tutankhamun was probably 8 or 9 years old when he became pharaoh, and his parentage reflects the genetic complications of Akhenaten's marriage policies. Modern DNA analysis has confirmed that his parents were full siblings, most likely Akhenaten and one of his sister wives. This young boy, barely old enough to understand the forces swirling around him, became the vehicle through which Egypt would abandon the Amarna experiment and return to traditional religion. His reign was guided by powerful court officials who had survived the tumultuous Amarna period and were determined to restore stability to the kingdom. The elderly Ai, who may have been Nefertiti's father and who had served as a senior advisor throughout the Amarna period, became the power behind the throne. The general Horemheb, who commanded what remained of Egypt's military forces, provided the muscle necessary to enforce the restoration. These men had witnessed firsthand the chaos and decline of the later Amarna years, and were convinced that only a return to traditional ways could save the kingdom. The young king's wife was Enkhesenamun, the same Enkhesenamun who had been elevated to the position of chief queen during Akhenaten's final years. This remarkable woman had experienced the full complexity of the Amarna family arrangements, serving as daughter, wife, and stepmother to various members of the royal house before finally becoming queen to a boy who may have been her half-brother, son, or nephew. Her marriage to Tutankhamun represented one final attempt to preserve some continuity with the Amarna period while facilitating the transition to a new regime. The restoration began almost immediately. Within 3 years of his ascension, the boy king had changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, honoring the god Ammonius, whom his predecessor had tried to destroy. The court abandoned Akhetaten and returned to Memphis, leaving the revolutionary capital to be slowly reclaimed by the desert. The great temples of the Aten were closed, their priests dismissed, and their treasuries transferred to the restored temples of the traditional gods. A royal decree inscribed on a stela found at Karnak announced the restoration of the traditional gods in language that explicitly condemned the Amarna period. The temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine down to the marshes of the delta had gone to pieces. Their shrines had become desolate, grown over with weeds, their sanctuaries as if they had never been, their halls serving as footpaths. The land was topsy-turvy, and the gods turned their backs upon this land. If one prayed to a god to seek counsel from him, he would never come. And if one sought to beseech a goddess in the same way, she would never come at all. This restoration decree provides valuable insight into how the traditional establishment viewed the Amarna period. Rather than describing Akhenaten's reign as simply misguided or heretical, it presents a period as one of cosmic disorder when the proper relationship between gods and humans had been disrupted. The language emphasizes restoration and healing rather than punishment, suggesting that the new regime was more concerned with re-establishing stability than with revenge against Atenist holdouts. The young pharaoh, guided by his advisors, poured resources into rebuilding the temples that Akhenaten had abandoned or destroyed. The priests of Ammonius were restored to their positions of power and privilege, and elaborate rituals of traditional Egyptian religion were revived with renewed enthusiasm. The complex mythology that Akhenaten had dismissed as superstition was embraced as essential truth, and the artistic innovations of the Amarna period were rejected in favor of traditional Egyptian styles. The economic restoration was equally comprehensive. The vast estates that had been transferred from Ammonius to the Aten were returned to their original owners, along with compensation for the disruption and losses suffered during the Amarna period. Trade relationships that had been damaged by the religious revolution were carefully rebuilt, often requiring diplomatic missions to reassure foreign partners that Egypt had returned to familiar patterns of behavior. The artistic counter-revolution was particularly thorough. The naturalistic styles that had characterized Amarna art were abandoned in favor of idealized traditional forms. The intimate family scenes that had been so distinctive of Akhenaten's reign disappeared, replaced by formal images that emphasized the pharaoh's divine nature and cosmic responsibilities. Even the architectural innovations of the Amarna period were rejected. The open-air temples gave way to traditional enclosed sanctuaries, and the residential architecture returned to conventional palace designs that emphasized royal separation from ordinary humanity. But the most systematic destruction was yet to come. After Tutankhamun's early death at around age 19, possibly from complications related to genetic disorders caused by inbreeding, possibly from injuries sustained in warfare or hunting accidents, and the brief reign of Ai, the General Horemheb seized the throne and launched a campaign of deliberate historical erasure that was unprecedented in its thoroughness. Every mention of Akhenaten's name was chiseled from temple walls. Every statue bearing his likeness was smashed. The revolutionary capital of Akenaten was systematically dismantled, its stone blocks carted away to be used in other construction projects. The official king list compiled in later dynasties simply skipped from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as of the 18 years of Akhenaten's reign had never existed. The pharaoh who had dared to challenge the gods was condemned to the worst fate imaginable in ancient Egyptian belief: to be forgotten, to have his name obliterated from memory, to die a second death in the realm of forgetting. This damnatio memoriae extended to defacing boundary stele, reusing Talatat blocks in Ramesside constructions, and omitting Akhenaten from Abydos king lists, a theological purge to restore Ma'at, viewing the Amarna era as chaotic heresy. His daughter wives, his revolutionary city, his vision of one god ruling over all creation, everything was systematically erased. For more than 3,000 years, this erasure was largely successful. It was only when archaeologists began excavating the ruins of Amarna in the late 19th century that the full scope of his revolution began to emerge. Modern DNA analysis confirmed the incestuous relationships within his family, revealing genetic defects in Tutankhamun that spoke to the human cost of divine ambition. Today, as we stand among the ruins of Akenaten, we can still hear the echo of hammers striking stone, erasing names, faces, and dreams from the walls of eternity. The pharaoh who married his daughters in service to his god, who proclaimed that everything his people believed was false, remains frozen in that moment of revolutionary possibility, when one man's vision of truth collided with the weight of 3,000 years of tradition, leaving behind only whispers in the desert wind of what might have been. Akhenaten's legacy, rediscovered through Amarna excavations by Flinders Petrie and others, challenges views of ancient Egypt as static, highlighting a brief era of radical change that influenced later monotheistic ideas, though indirectly, and underscoring the interplay of religion, politics, and culture in shaping history.